Interiors are, of course, going to change as we move through the English Renaissance, and there are various forms that I want to concentrate on. Now, the interiors tend to develop during this time. They're going to bring in more and more decorative items. In other words, items that don't have a specific pragmatic functional purpose. And they're doing this to add an air of beauty, an air of an aesthetic to their living space, something that we're very familiar with today, but of course in the Romanesque, you're not seeing that much of that. And one of the things we're going to see are palampores, which are these cotton fabrics, these cotton textiles. They're going to be painted, sometimes with various tree of life forms or Jesse tree forms. We see a variety of different forms, but generally they're going to be painted rather than embroidered or developed as tapestry. They will have a lot of imports. Now, these are primarily coming from the East, and here in this example, we actually have a number of imports being used for show. For example, the vases that are coming in from China, the rug coming in from Persia, Iran, Islam, the Middle East in general. We have a tapestry that's coming from Northern Europe. So you get the idea. They're bringing in items primarily to show status. Now, for the working class, most of their decor is going to be a lot simpler than most of what we're looking at. Most of the items will be pragmatic. Now, sometimes they will have an item that appears to us to be very beautiful, but it always has a functional purpose to it. Now let's start with floors. For the most part, in the upper classes, you have various stone floors, from marble floors, marble tiled floors like we see here, to flagstone, to various stone floors. But of course, that's generally only on the first floor. When you move upstairs, it's generally going to be oak wood that's laid out. They're using oak because they have a lot of it. It's very strong and very durable. But the widths of the boards will vary considerably. So you could have a board that's 6 inches wide next to a board that's 2 inches wide. They're using the materials that they have. After all, really good materials aren't going into flooring. They're going into other areas like paneling. And they frequently cover those floors with some kind of rug, some kind of area rug. So you're not really looking at it anyway. In terms of walls, of course, we tend to think of wainscoting from this period. And this is typically a lining that's going to exist in the lower part of the wall. Now, wainscoting kind of goes back and forth with paneling, which we'll get to in a second. And of course, the reason that you use either one of these is to hide defects in the plaster. Now, if you've ever tried to lay plaster on a wall, I'm talking starting from lath and building up. So you've got your rough plaster and a couple of coats of fine plaster, and then you've got your skim coats. It takes a lot of time. It actually takes a considerable amount of skill. If you're wealthy enough, you can afford to cover that, and so you will. And in this case, they're using paneling, but of course we see wainscoting as well. And the paneling typically is going to be made up of small panels with large beams or large pieces in between. This is because they're limited by the size of wood that they have. The technology is different than what we have today. Today I can get a 4-foot by 8-foot panel of birch or any number of other woods down at my local big box hardware store. But at the time, the panels are much smaller. Also, they're trying to use the finest quality, so you're going to have smaller pieces. Now, the wainscoting or paneling will often also be decorated. In this case, we see a linen fold motif, which is really, really common through the English Renaissance, just like it was during the Gothic. Now, towards the end of the period, the trend tends towards plaster because plaster requires more skill to lay. And it starts to trend towards painting that plaster, which we don't see here. Here we see a simple white. This would be maybe a middle-class home. But oftentimes they'll use pretty bright colors. In fact, when we get to the Americas and things like colonial Williamsburg, you'll discover very rapidly that most of these rooms will have been painted in nearly primary and secondary colors incredibly bright. They faded with age. They weren't painted that way. Now, in terms of ceilings, of course, when you think of Tudor England, you're thinking of open beam ceilings, something like this. Now, that is really common, but as we move towards the end of the period, as we move into the Jacobean, for example, we start to see something called parge work. And this is an ornamental facing for plaster walls, where we have low relief created in the space. So here we have a geometric form in this arch. Here we have sort of a paneled form. And what they're doing is you have highly skilled laborers that can lay this out by hand. They're not molding this in the place. And then these smaller pieces, like the florals, may be molded in place, but even that is particularly difficult. There are actually YouTube videos you can find of people in India and elsewhere doing this all by hand, and it's remarkable the work that they're doing. Now, you can have raised parge work, as we see in these two examples, or recessed, as we see here. You can also see this on the exterior of the house, especially in Tudor England, where this will be on the outside, sort of showing off. Again, it's a show of status, like so many other things. When we get into fireplaces and stairs, things change again. When we start out in the Tudor period, the fireplace tends to have a 4-part section to it, almost a pointed arch. So there's always going to be a point in the middle, and here we're going to have it rise up to the point and then 2 verticals, often with some classical elements setting it off. So, for example, classical columns. We can get something very, very ornate, such as this example, where you see the point isn't there. They've rounded it a little bit, but we have this stone inlay put in place, or stone inset put in place, and the columns here have been decorated massively. We've got some of that shell idea, maybe a little bit of God runing going on here. We've got these very ornate columns splitting it up into panels. So things are changing. And of course, by the time we get to the Elizabethan period, the point is there, but very quickly you're going to get a simple rectangular form developing. Above them, you frequently have a fanciful piece. This is known as a chimney piece, not a mantelpiece. Mantelpiece is something that sits on the mantle, but rather this covers the chimney. And here we see a very decorative form with a crest, a couple of animals, a griffin, for example. We have these caryatid forms off on the side. So they're creating something very, very ornate. Now, in terms of stairs, up until this point, stairs are purely functional. You jam them in wherever you can in the house. So it's going to be a dark corner where you're going to jam the stairs in. There's no landing. It just kind of makes one continuous loop. But in the Jacobean period, sort of late in the English Renaissance, they are going to be inspired by the Italians in these massive stone staircases that we tend to see in Italy. So what they do is they start developing landings for the staircases. They tend to get much wider. The balustrades get more ornate. We tend to have some form of paneling running through the staircase. So instead of something that's purely utilitarian, there's a certain element of beauty incorporated into it. And of course, the rug isn't necessarily, or this form of rug, isn't necessarily historically accurate, but you get the sense from it that the staircase is as much a showpiece as any other element in the house. It has lost its purely utilitarian form.